She is a trapper's daughter. She has nothing to her name but a small fire and a long winter. The hunters have the wolf surrounded. The wolf is not fully a wolf. The child inside the creature is afraid. She does not know that yet. She only knows that something small and shivering is about to die. She steps between it and the men with the bows. She does not think. She never does. That is both her ruin and her grace. And the question, the one that will take the whole of winter to answer, is this: what do you do when the thing you saved was never yours to keep? The snow came early that year. It always did, on the frontier. But that autumn the first flurries arrived before the last of the leaves had thought to fall, so for one strange week Sepha had watched the birches wear both, golden and white at once, like something caught between two states of being, unable to fully become either. She'd thought it was beautiful, in the way that lonely people find beauty in things that won't answer back. Her father had been dead 7 months. She did not count the days anymore, but she felt them in her body the way old injuries announce themselves in cold weather. A dull ache just below the ribs, a heaviness in the wrists when she lifted the traps. He had taught her to set them. He had taught her to read snow for tracks, to distinguish the 3-toed drag of a fox from the clean-paired stamps of a rabbit, to tell by the depth of a print how recently an animal had passed and how frightened it had been when it moved. He had taught her everything she needed to survive out here. At the edge of the map where the kingdom's reach grew thin and the wolves ran deep. He had not taught her what to do with the quiet. The cottage was 14 paces from wall to wall. She had counted. One sleepless February when her father was still alive and snoring in the corner, just to have something to do with her hands and her mind. 14 paces. A hearth, a table, 2 rope beds, a loft where she stored the dried meat and the extra pelts. There was a window on the east side that let in the morning light, and a window on the west side that let in nothing useful, and that she had stuffed with rags and wax against the draft. The floor was packed dirt. The walls were good. Her father had been careful with the chinking, and the roof had only one bad place over the loft, where she'd set a bucket for when it rained. It was a hard, small life. She had chosen to love it anyway. That was Sepha's way, and she knew it. Loving what you had rather than mourning what you didn't. It was a discipline, like keeping the traps clean. You had to work at it every day or it fell apart. She was 23. She had never been to the capital. She had seen the king's soldiers twice. Once when they came through collecting the border tithe, and once when a regiment passed on the road below the ridge, moving south in the snow, their colors bright and cold, and gone in a morning. She'd watched from the tree line, alone, and felt the kind of longing that has nothing specific at its center. Not longing for soldiers, or for cities. Just longing. The flavor of it when you are young and solitary and the world keeps moving past you, like water past a stone. She did not think of herself as unhappy. She thought of herself as waiting, though she couldn't have said what for. The traps needed checking every morning before the light changed. 3 lines this season. The eastern run along the creek, the high run up into the birch stands, and the short northern line she'd set more in hope than in certainty, following a fox trail that had come and gone. The eastern run was her best. She brought in 2 rabbits on a good day, sometimes a marten. The pelts she cured herself, stacking them in the loft against the trade she'd make in spring when the factor came through with his wagon. It wasn't much, it was enough. Barely. She had been on the high run when she heard them. Male voices, 3, maybe 4. And underneath them, threaded through the cold still air like a needle through cloth, a sound that stopped her breath. A cry. Not a human cry. Not quite. Something higher. Something that wavered between animal pain and something the animal had no word for. She stood in the birch trees with her boot half lifted out of a drift and she listened. And the sound came again, and her chest did something complicated and immediate that she didn't stop to examine. She moved toward it. Later, weeks later, Months later, she would try to remember the exact shape of the choice, and she could not find it. There was no moment of deliberation. There was the sound, and then there was her body moving toward it. Her trapper's instincts knew that she should assess first that unknown sounds in the deep wood could mean bears, could mean human danger, could mean any number of things that a woman alone had very good reason to avoid. She did not assess. She went. The clearing was a natural bowl in the hillside where an old elm had come down, and the snow had filled the crater of its roots. The hunters were arranged around the far edge, 4 of them. She counted fast, armed with bows and one with a short hunting spear, and they wore city clothes under their furs, rich men's sport hunting gear, rather than working trappers' worn leather. She registered all of this in the half-second before her eyes found what was in the bowl. A wolf pup. Small. Impossibly small for the cold it had survived, young enough that its ears still had that soft, unfixed quality, folded slightly at the tips, not yet fully committed to their final shape. Silver-gray fur. Eyes that were, even from this distance, extraordinarily gold. It had backed itself against the root ball of the fallen elm, and it was shaking. A full-body vibration she could see from 30 feet. And it was making that sound, low and high at once. A sound like something trying very hard not to be afraid and failing. The man with the spear took a step toward it. "Hey!" Her voice came out harder than she expected. The 4 hunters turned, startled, clearly unused to being interrupted, clearly unused to a woman stepping out of the trees alone. She was holding her belt knife. She did not remember drawing it. "This your land?" The nearest man said, annoyed rather than threatened. "No. Is it yours?" A pause. The man with the spear had stopped, but he hadn't lowered it. "We're hunting wolf," said the nearest man, with the tone of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow. "King's Frontier. Open season. Open season on pups?" She kept her eyes on the one with the spear. "It's barely 4 months old. A wolf's a wolf." "Is that so?" She took 3 steps into the clearing, placing herself between the men and the root ball. She felt the pup behind her, felt it the way you feel heat from a fire before you see it. A warmth that didn't make sense given the snow and the cold and the 30 feet between them. Her heart was doing something loud. "Then, you won't mind leaving it. You came out here for sport. This isn't sport." There was a longer pause. The 4 men looked at each other with the uncomfortable calculation of men who are not quite sure how dangerous the obstacle in front of them is. She was a woman alone. She was also clearly not afraid of them, which was its own kind of information. "You're going to get out of the way," the man with the spear said, but he was frowning. A frown was not a step forward. "I'm going to stand right here," Sepha said, "until you get bored and leave." She did not know where this certainty came from. She felt it anyway. Bedrock certainty, all the way down. The kind that doesn't come from calculation. She was not going to move. The men were uncomfortable in the way that cruel people are when witnesses appear, and the cruelty suddenly costs something. They muttered among themselves. The one with the spear shifted his weight. She watched his hands and not his face, the way her father had taught her to watch animals. The body tells you what the face is trying to hide. He lowered the spear. Not graciously. With the specific resentment of a man who has decided that this particular trouble isn't worth it. Not because it's wrong, but because she will not yield, and there are easier kills elsewhere. They left the way men like that always leave. Too loud, too deliberate, taking their time to show they weren't being chased. One of them said something over his shoulder that she didn't catch and didn't try to. She waited until she couldn't hear their boots in the snow anymore. Then she turned around. The pup had not moved. It was still pressed against the root ball, still shaking, those gold eyes fixed on her with an expression that she would have said, if anyone had asked, was calculation. Too much calculation for an animal. Too much steadiness behind the fear. "Hey," she said softly. The same word, different weight entirely. She crouched in the snow. "It's all right. They're gone. The pup didn't move. She didn't reach for it. She had learned that with frightened animals, you don't reach, you wait. You make yourself small and you breathe and you let the animals decide. She stayed crouched in the snow, which was very cold and getting colder, and she looked at the pup, and the pup looked at her, and she noticed again how large the eyes were, how almost human the expression in them. Not quite animal. Not quite. She should leave it. That was the sensible thing. It was a wolf pup, and leaving it in the wood was where it belonged, hunters or no hunters, and she had traps to check and a long walk home, and not enough hours of light left to spare. The pup made that sound again, just once, very small, like a question. She held out her hand, palm down, fingers loose. She waited. It took a very long time, long enough that her knees began to ache, and the cold had worked through her boot soles and into her feet. And then, one careful step at a time, the pup crossed the distance between the root ball and her hand and pressed its cold nose against her knuckles. Its whole body was shaking. She picked it up. It was lighter than she expected. All that fur and all that trembling, and underneath it, just a little creature, bird-boned and terrified. She tucked it inside her coat against her chest, where the cold couldn't get at it. She felt its heartbeat, fast and uneven. She felt the shaking begin, very slowly, to subside. She walked home through the snow. By the time she reached the cottage, she had named him. Bram. She didn't know why. It came to her on the walk, rising up without a reason the way the right words sometimes do. And she tried it quietly, just whispered it to the small warm weight against her chest. And the pup made a sound, low and soft, that she chose to interpret as agreement. Bram. It fit him. That was all. She built the fire up and set him by the hearth in the nest of old blankets she kept for patching, and she watched him shake himself into stillness while the heat slowly reached him. His coat was silver gray but with a faint undertone. She saw it when the firelight hit it right. A deep, almost metallic bronze at the roots, the kind of color that didn't belong to any wolf she'd ever seen in this part of the frontier. She filed it away without meaning to, the way she filed away anomalies in track patterns or weather. Noticed, not yet understood. She gave him water first. He drank with a desperate, focused intensity that told her he'd been cold and frightened and alone for longer than just this morning. She heated a little broth from the rabbit bones she'd been saving. Nothing rich, nothing wrong for a young stomach. And she set it on the floor and stepped back and watched him drink that too. His ears, she noticed, were already straightening. He ate, and then he slept. Sensafa sat across the room and watched the firelight move over his fur, and felt the particular tenderness of having given comfort to something that couldn't ask for it. She did not know what she was keeping. She thought she was keeping a wolf. She would understand later. Much later, though it would not feel like later. Because winter has its own time, and the interior time of caring for something small has no clocks in it at all. She would understand later what she had actually brought in from the cold. Not tonight. Tonight he was just Bram, sleeping in the firelight, and she was just Sefa, watching him, and outside the snow was falling again, and the cottage was warm, and the world beyond the walls could wait. She let it wait. 3 days. That was how long he slept, mostly. Coming awake for water, for food, for the careful warmth of her hand smoothing over his fur. He bore it with a dignity that she found remarkable in a pup, that slight stillness under her touch, as if he was deciding whether to allow it and then deciding yes. Not the panicked flinching of a truly wild animal. Not the complete surrender of a domesticated one. Something in between. Something with opinions about it. She checked the traps. She came home. She fed him. On the 4th day, he followed her to the door. Not begging, not whining. Just present, sitting at her heel like. And she noticed this and set it aside, like someone who had been taught to walk at heel and was waiting to be given leave to go. "I'm coming back," she told him, which was something she had not told anything in 7 months, and which cost her more than she expected. I'm just checking the eastern line." He watched her go. When she came back, he was in the same place exactly, and something in his expression, she was beginning to stop apologizing to herself for reading expression in his face. Something in it had the quality of, "I knew you would." He had good days and strange days. Most days he was simply a pup, endlessly curious about everything in the cottage, batting at the hanging herbs, chewing experimentally on the corner of her second-best boot, discovering that if he sat in exactly the right spot by the fire, his shadow made an interesting shape on the wall. She watched him investigate her world with that too careful attention, always present, always observing, and she thought, this one is going to be extraordinary when he's grown. She thought wolf when she thought that. She was still thinking wolf. Then there were the strange days. Once, she came in from the traps to find him sitting at the table. Not on the floor, not jumped up onto it. He was somehow. She stood in the doorway and could not work out the geometry. He was somehow sitting at the table, upright, in a posture that was deeply, specifically wrong for a wolf. Head up, a kind of patient waiting in his spine. She said his name, and he turned and immediately dropped to the floor, and she stood there for a long moment after, her hand still on the door, thinking, that was not a wolf sitting at my table. She put it away. Not deleted. Her father had taught her not to delete anomalies, but stored, waiting for more information. Another time, she woke in the night to find him by her bed, standing, completely still. She was between sleep and waking, and she said, "Bram?" And he put one paw up on the edge of the mattress and looked at her, and she said, still more asleep than awake, "Come on then." And he climbed up and curled against her side, and she fell back into sleep with her hand in his fur. It was only in the morning that she thought, he understood me. Not trained dog understood. Understood. The frontier was cold and isolated and full of things that didn't fit easy categories, and Sepha had grown up here, and she was not, by nature, someone who needed easy categories. She was someone who noticed, who cataloged, who waited for the pattern to reveal itself. So she waited. She did not have to wait long. The night it happened, there had been no warning in the weather, or maybe there had, and she hadn't been watching for the right thing. The temperature had dropped steeply at dusk, sharper than the gradual fade of cold she'd grown used to. And the fire had been working harder than usual, and she'd added the last of the evening's wood, and promised herself she'd bring more in from the stack before she slept. She was dreaming about her father when she woke, not a grief dream, one of the ordinary ones, where he was simply there, telling her something she couldn't quite hear over the wind in the dream. She surfaced through it slowly, holding on to the warmth of it, and then she was awake, and the fire was lower than she'd meant to let it get, and something in the cottage was different. She lay still for a moment. The weight against her side was wrong. Not gone, still warm, still present, still breathing, but heavier. The specific heaviness of was different, and the shape of it against her hip was different, and she was fully awake before she looked down because her body already knew what her mind was still refusing. She looked down, a child, a boy of perhaps 4, perhaps 5. She could not have said exactly, tucked against her side in the blankets, deeply asleep. Small face, dark hair, skin with the particular quality of someone who spends time outdoors. He was wearing nothing, which was not a crisis, because the blankets were thick, and her own warmth was in them, but it registered as important. His cheek was pressed against her shoulder, and his breathing was the slow, even breathing of a child who trusts completely where he is sleeping. Sepha did not move. She did not breathe loudly. She lay very still, and she looked at him for a long time. His hair, she noticed, was silver dark, not gray, not black, the exact color that only exists between those two things, like winter birch bark in dim light. And his eyelashes were. She did not know why she noticed this. She simply did. His eyelashes were remarkable, longer than a child's eyelashes needed to be, long and curved and absolutely still against his cheeks. There was a small scar near his left ear, very faint, more like a mark than a wound, a crescent shape that she would have said was a birthmark if she hadn't been fairly certain it was something else. She breathed. He didn't wake. She very carefully, very slowly, reached for the extra blanket at the foot of the bed and drew it up over him without disturbing his sleep. She lay back. She looked at the ceiling where the firelight made its unsteady shapes, and she let her mind do what it needed to do. She had been sleeping beside a wolf pup. She was now sleeping beside a child. These were the same creature. She breathed again, slow and deliberate, the way her father had taught her to breathe when she found a fox in a trap that was still alive, and she had to make a decision fast and make it calmly. All right, the cottage. The fire, lower than it should be. She needed to tend it, but she was not getting up with this child's head on her shoulder. The child, who was a shifter. The child, who was young enough that his shift had been involuntary. She was certain of that. It had the quality of a dream slip, not a deliberate change. She had heard of it. In the stories, her father traded with passing trappers. That shifter young could shift in their sleep, especially when frightened, when they were young enough that their bodies hadn't yet learned the containment adults took for granted. A shifter child, alone, hungry, hunted. Someone was looking for him. That thought came in all its weight and settled. Someone powerful was looking for this child. She had known it vaguely since the hunters, but she was honest with herself. She had been not knowing it very deliberately, because knowing it meant confronting the next piece, which was, the child did not belong to her, and whoever he belonged to was going to come. She lay in the dark with the boy's cheek against her shoulder, and the dying fire throwing uncertain light, and she felt the thing she'd been not feeling settle fully into her chest and stay there. He was not hers. She knew that. She had always known it. She had simply not known it loudly. In the morning, when the fire was built up again and the cold blue dawn was coming through the east window, the boy woke. He opened his eyes, and they were gold, entirely gold, the same impossible color she'd been seeing in the wolf pup's eyes for 2 weeks. And he looked at her, and she looked back, and she said, "Good morning, Bram." He did not flinch at the name. He considered it with the gravity of someone who has opinions about names. Then he said, in a voice that was small and still sleepy and carried the faint formality of a child who has been taught speech carefully rather than just absorbing it, "That is not my name." "I know," she said. "I didn't know your name, so I gave you one." He thought about this. "It will do," he said, and pulled the blanket up around his chin, and that was that. She made breakfast. She let him choose how much to tell her and moved through the morning, giving him space to find his way to it. She was a trapper. She knew that patience was the whole of the skill, that what you wanted came to you only when you stopped reaching for it. He watched her cook. He watched her move around the small cottage with the efficient economy of someone who has done every motion 10,000 times in exactly this space. He ate what she gave him, porridge with a little dried fruit she'd been saving. Not wolf food, human food. Which told her something about how long he'd been in human form before she'd found him. With the careful appetite of a child, practicing not to seem hungry. Then he said, "There are men looking for me." She set down her spoon. "I know, not good men." "No," she agreed. "The ones I saw were not good men." He was quiet for a moment. She watched his hands around the bowl, small hands, neat, the nails a little long, and she noticed that he held the bowl with a specific grip, both hands, thumbs parallel, that was. She couldn't account for why she knew this. The grip of a child who had been taught the formal way to hold a cup before he'd learned the informal way. Taught. Not by a woman alone in a cottage. Taught. "Will you send me away?" he asked. He was looking at his porridge. "No," she said, immediately and without thinking, which was not a decision she had made consciously, and which she recognized in the same breath as the single most consequential thing she had said since her father died. Not until you're safe. And not, she added, because she was 23 and honest, and she owed him that much, without making sure of where you're going. He looked up at her, those gold eyes in his small face, with those improbable eyelashes. All right, he said, and finished his porridge. He was careful with what he told her. Not secretive, not a child's sulky secretive, or a frightened child's defensive secretive. Careful, measured. Like someone who had been taught, at a very young age, that information was its own kind of currency and should not be spent carelessly, he told her. There were bad men. They had taken him from his home. He had gotten away from them in the forest. She had found him. He did not tell her where his home was, or who his people were, or what the bad men wanted. She did not push. She built the fire higher, and she let him spend that first human form day exploring the cottage, with the same thorough attention he'd given it as a pup, and she watched him touch the things he'd only been able to sniff before, the hanging herbs, the pelts on the loft railing, the carved horn handle of her father's old knife on its peg by the door. He picked that up and held it, and she watched him hold it, and she thought, he knows what a knife is for. Not fear knows. Uses knows. My father's, she said. He set it back exactly where it had been, oriented exactly as it had been. Mine is. He stopped. She waited. I don't know where mine is, he said, which was not what he had started to say, but she let it be what he'd said. At night he shifted again in his sleep. She was awake for it this time, a slow wavering, the way a reflection wavers in disturbed water. And then the warm solidity against her side was different again, and she had a wolf pup tucked under her arm, and his heartbeat was slow and even, and she said nothing. Just pulled the blanket around them both and went back to sleep. By the end of the first week of his human days, he was beginning to spend more time as a boy than a pup, though the shifts still slid and wavered at the margins. She had learned. He spoke 2 languages, though he tried to pretend he only spoke 1. She'd heard him mutter in the second one when he was frustrated with a knot she'd given him to work. Something to keep his hands busy while she mended, and she'd recognized enough of it to know it was not a frontier dialect. It was court language. The formal speech of the capital. He was not from the frontier. She had known that, vaguely, in the way you know things you're not quite looking at directly. Now she looked at it. He was not from the frontier. He shifted with an instinctive control that was unusual, even in a shifter child his age. He had been taught formal grips and formal speech, and how to set a knife back exactly as he'd found it. He spoke court language in his sleep when he was frustrated. She lay awake that night with the wolf bram warm against her side, and she did the arithmetic she'd been refusing to do. The missing heir. She had heard it, last autumn before the snow, when the factor had come through with his wagon, and she'd traded her first pelts and stood in the cold and listened to him tell the news from the capital the way he always did, trading gossip along with goods. The Alpha King's heir. Only 3 at the time, or had the factor said 4? Gone. Stolen, the rumors said. Taken by a faction that wanted the line disrupted, the succession unsettled. The factor had said, the king would burn the world to find that child. She'd thought about it for a day and then filed it away under things that happen to powerful people in places I will never go, and she'd gone back to her traps. She lay in the dark with the king's stolen air warm against her side, and she breathed. The king. The Alpha King's heir. She did not even know his real name. She had been calling him Bram, which he had allowed with the tolerant dignity of someone accepting a nickname from a well-meaning person who didn't know better. She pressed her face briefly into his fur. He smelled of pine and something underneath it. Something warm and specific, like embers. Like a fire that's been burning in a clean stone hearth for a very long time. Like something that belongs somewhere particular. She breathed him in and she thought, I have to keep him safe long enough to get him home. And underneath that, underneath the part she was willing to name, I don't know how to give this back. She stayed awake longer than she should have. When sleep finally came, it brought no dreams. A name. He told her his name on a Tuesday. She always remembered it was a Tuesday because she'd been counting her pelt supply, and she always counted pelts on Tuesdays. It was a habit from her father's accounting days, and she was sitting cross-legged on the floor with pelts laid out around her in rows, when he came to stand in front of her and said it. Caius. She looked up. That is my name, he said with all the precision of a child who has practiced this particular disclosure. Caius Dravenmore. A pause in which she understood he was watching her face for recognition. The Dravenmore line. You know it. She did. Of course she did. Everyone in the kingdom knew the Dravenmore name, the way you know certain things that are simply part of the structure of the world, the way you know the name of the river and the name of the capital and the name of the king. The king. She said the name back to him quietly. Caius. He let out a breath that had been, she realized, held since before he said it. Something in his small shoulders settled. Not relief, or not only relief, recognition. The relief of being known by your right name. My father's name is Dmitri, he said. He is. I know who your father is, she said. He nodded, once, the nod of a small person who is very tired of carrying a very large thing and has just been permitted, briefly, to set it down. She looked at him. This child she'd been calling Bram, who was the heir to the Dravenmore line, whose father was the Alpha King, whose father had been, according to a factor's winter gossip, searching without rest or mercy for the last however many months, and she felt the thing she'd been refusing to feel arrive in her, fully and stay. She was going to lose him. Not lose him to the hunters. She could keep him from the hunters. She was a trapper. She knew this land. She had a bolt hole in the hill behind the cottage that she'd kept clear and provisioned since her father's time, for the bad winters, for the kind of danger that came without warning. She was going to lose him to his own life, to his real name, and his palace, and his father who had been burning the world to find him. She looked at the child who had come in from the cold shaking and had let her warm him, who had slept against her side every night for weeks, and who had asked her, the morning after his first human form dawn, "Will you send me away?" She looked at him and she felt it entirely and she said nothing at all. She went back to counting pelts. Sepha, he said. She looked up. He will come, the boy said. Caius, Bram, both. When he comes, you must not be afraid of him. All right, she said. He is, a small frown. He is very loud, and very large, and he will be, when he has been frightened for a long time, and then the thing that frightened him stops, the frown deepened, a child searching for language large enough for the concept. He fills up all the space. I see, said Sepha. I am telling you so that you don't do something brave and stupid, Caius said, with the resigned air of someone who has had to issue this warning before, and expects it will not be heeded. She laughed. She had not laughed like that in months. Something startled out of her, genuine, brief. The boy looked briefly startled himself, and then something in his face shifted into an expression she had no word for, just watching her with a quality that was very still and very worry-burm. I can't promise that, she said. No, he agreed. I didn't think so. And then, in a smaller voice with his eyes on the pelts between them, I don't want to leave. She did not answer right away. She reached across the pelts and put her hand over his small hand on the floor, and she kept it there, and she let the silence be what it needed to be. I know, she said at last. The fire crackled. Somewhere outside, wind moved through the birches with a sound like water. He did not pull his hand away. The faction found the cottage on a Thursday. She knew something was wrong before she saw them, felt it in her skin the way the weather sometimes announced itself, a change in pressure, a quality to the stillness of the air. Caius was inside, human form today, and he felt it too. She could see it in the way he went alert, that specific stiffness in his spine that was not the stiffness of a frightened child, but the stillness of a child who has been trained to read threat. She put herself between him and the window and looked out. 5 men at the tree line. Not hunters, this time. Not the comfortable rich men's sport hunting kit. Armor, light but real, and swords. And one of them was issuing quiet directions with the economy of someone accustomed to commands being obeyed instantly. She knew what they were before she fully knew she knew it. "Upstairs," she said to Caius quietly. "The loft. The corner with the extra pelts. Get in and cover yourself, and do not move and do not shift." He did not argue. She had learned this about him. When it was real, he obeyed without drama, saving his considerable stores of stubbornness for smaller battles. He went up the ladder with a silence that was, for a 4-year-old, remarkable. She stood in the center of her cottage, and she thought very fast. The bolt hole was behind the cottage, accessible through the back wall, through the loose board she'd kept loose for exactly this kind of contingency. She could get to it. She could get Caius to it. But there were 5 of them, and the tree line was where they were, which meant they had already thought about the back of the cottage. She had a knife. She had a bow, badly strung, and needing new fletching. She had 14 paces of cottage, and a boy hidden in the loft and no one within a day's ride who would come if she called. The knock on the door was formal, not a pounding, a controlled, precise rapping, 4 beats, the kind of knock that communicates, "I have authority here, and I am exerting it politely as a professional courtesy before I stop being polite." She opened the door. The man on the step was shorter than the ones behind him, but he had the gravity of command on him, worn like a second coat. Brown eyes. A thin scar through his left eyebrow that divided it into 2 unequal halves. He looked at her with a professional calm that she recognized as the same thing she used when she needed to assess whether an animal was a danger, measuring, patient, not unkind. "Trapper," he said. He had the accent of the capital. "Soldier," she said. A slight shift in his expression. She'd surprised him, slightly. "Good. We're looking for something that may have come through this area. A wolf pup, young, unusual coloring, silver gray with." "I know what you're looking for," she said. The professional calm did not break. She gave him credit for that. "Then you'll understand that we need." "Who do you work for?" A pause. Brief. "The king's." "Which king's men?" she said, and she looked at him with all the steadiness she had, which was considerable, because she was a trapper's daughter, and she had spent her whole life looking at things that could hurt her and not flinching. "His men who want the heir found and returned. Or the other kind." The silence that followed had texture to it. The man's expression changed. Something behind the professional calm shifted, and she watched it, and she thought, "I've said the thing that separates you. The other kind," he said slowly, "would not knock." She looked at him. She looked past him at the men in the yard, at the tree line, at the clean, cold air between her door and the birches, where the light was going gray with afternoon. She stepped aside and let him in. His name was Oren. He was the commander of the faction that had taken Caius, or rather, he had been. He was, it emerged in the difficult, incremental conversation that followed, not a willing member of it. He had been a soldier in service to the lord who'd organized the kidnapping. A lord named Tarvel, who had debts and ambitions, and the specific moral vacancy of men who have decided that the ends, the political disruption, the leverage, the chaos that benefits those who've placed their bets on chaos, justify what's been done to a child. Oren had not known what he was being sent to do. By the time he understood it, he was too deep to refuse without losing everything. He had been the heir's primary keeper for 6 months. He had been kind when no one was watching. Sepha understood this about him in the first 10 minutes, because she was good at reading what people cost themselves to tell, and Oren's account of his involvement cost him considerably. "He is alive," she said. "He is unhurt." Oren closed his eyes. Something in his face that had been held tight since he walked in released all at once. "I need," he said and stopped. The careful soldier's composure was still there but thinner now, worn through in places. I need to know he is safe before whatever comes next. I need to know that first. She looked at him for a long moment. Caius, she called, toward the loft. A pause. The faint sound of a small body navigating the ladder with dignity. The boy came and stood at the bottom of the ladder and looked at Oren, and the look between them was complicated. The look of two people who know each other across a situation that has not been good for either of them and are now, in the presence of a third person, navigating how to be. Oren, Caius said. My lord, Oren said, and his voice was a soldier's voice, trained and formal, and then it was not, and the brief crack in it said everything about the 6 months. The boy crossed the room and put his small hand briefly on the man's arm. 1 second. The gesture of someone who has been taught formality and is choosing, this once, to set it aside. Then he came and stood next to Sifa, and his shoulder was against her hip, and he looked up at her, and she looked down at him, and neither of them said anything. Oren watched this. Something in his expression shifted and settled into something that was not quite grief and not quite relief, and lived exactly at the border between them. Lord Tarvel's men are coming, he said. He knows the boy is here. I came ahead. I wanted. He stopped. Started again. I wanted to reach the cottage first, to give you warning. How far behind you? Sepha said. 2 hours, maybe less. And the king's men? Oren looked at her steadily. Also coming. Also less than 2 hours, in the other direction. He paused. Your cottage is between them. She looked at the window, at the skies going gray. She looked down at Caius. He was already looking at her. His gold eyes in the dim light of the afternoon were not frightened. They were waiting. They had the quality she'd seen in them a dozen times now. Patient, measuring, watching to see what she would do. She breathed. All right, she said, and pulled her father's coat off the peg. What happened next was not one thing but several, all at once and in the following order, which was not entirely an order. She sent Oren out the back with directions to the bolt hole and instructions to stay there and stay human and not to move until she came for him or until someone who was clearly the king's searchers found him, at which point he was to walk out with his hands open. She was not certain this would save him. She was fairly certain that going out the front would not. She gave him the choice, and he chose the bolt hole, which she thought was probably the right choice for a man whose chances depended entirely on who reached him first. She sent Caius. She did not send him. She could not send him anywhere. But she told him, and he listened, which was as close as it came with him. She told him to stay inside, to stay human if he could, to stay away from the windows. He looked at her with those gold eyes and said, You are going to do something brave and stupid. I am going to stand in my own doorway, she said, and wait for whichever party arrives first and try to tell the difference between the kind that wants him back and the kind that wants him used. Caius considered this. That is actually reasonable, he said, with the tone of someone who had expected worse. Thank you, she said. Stay inside. She went out and stood in the snow. The afternoon was the particular color of winter afternoons when the sun has given up but hasn't admitted it yet. A gray so pale it was almost silver, and the birches were dark lines in it. And her breath made small clouds that vanished quickly in the cold. She stood in the yard, and she looked at the tree line, and she was afraid. But the fear was underneath a steadiness that came from. She could not have named where it came from. From having already made the decision, maybe. From knowing exactly what she was protecting and why. She heard them before she saw them. Not Tarvel's men. They would come quietly, professionally. These were, she heard a horse, not quiet, moving fast through snow, and then another, and then voices, and then they broke through the tree line on the southern edge, in a way that suggested they had not been tracking carefully, but rather moving with a speed that had given up on quiet entirely. 7 riders, king's colors, and at the front, on a horse that was black and large enough to make all the other horses look like ponies, by comparison, a man who did not need the colors to tell you what he was. He was Caius had warned her. He fills up all the space. He was tall in the saddle and broad in the way that meant something specific in the shifter world. Not simply size, but presence. The particular quality of authority that was not performed, but simply there, radiating outward the way heat radiates from a fire, unasked for and unavoidable. He was wearing dark riding clothes rather than armor, which meant he had not stopped to change after learning something, had simply ridden immediately from wherever he'd been when the news came. His hair was dark and his jaw was unshaven and his eyes were, even at 20 feet, even coming toward her at a controlled canter that barely contained its urgency. His eyes were gold. The same gold. She registered this, filed it, with the weight it deserved. And she stood in the snow and did not move. He pulled the horse up 10 feet from her. The animal was breathing hard, steaming in the cold, and he controlled it one-handed without visible effort, the kind of one-handed horsemanship that is so deeply ingrained it has become unconscious. He looked at her. She looked back. "The cottage," he said, and his voice was. Caius had not warned her about his voice, which was deep and contained and held. She heard it clearly, a specific tension, the tension of a man who has been holding something back for a very long time, and is now so close to releasing it that the holding is itself nearly unbearable. "The boy. Is he here?" It was not a question. "He's inside," she said. "He's safe. He's unhurt." Something happened to his face that she did not look away from. Just a moment, a fraction of a moment, where the king's composure, which was clearly considerable and clearly practiced, cracked along a very specific line and showed what was underneath it, which was relief so vast it was almost pain. The particular expression of someone who has been afraid of one single thing for a very long time, and has just been told that thing is all right, and the relief of it is so large it doesn't know what shape to take. He breathed then, "Are you his keeper?" "No," she said, "I'm his." She stopped, found the word. "I'm the one who found him in the snow." He looked at her. She looked back. Something moved through his expression that she didn't have a category for. "Inside," he said, and it was directed at his riders, quick and low, and they moved, 3 of them circling the cottage perimeter, and he dismounted. And she had one instant of sheer physical awareness of the fact that on horseback he had been large, and on the ground he was. She breathed and stood her ground. "He's not frightened," she said quietly. "He's been calm. If you go in there with all of that." She gestured briefly at the men spreading out, at the general, controlled urgency of the king's arrival. "He's going to need it to be calm. He's 4 years old." The king stopped. He looked at her as if she had said something he had not expected to hear, and she looked back steadily. And after a moment, the controlled urgency shifted slightly. Still there, still present, but adjusted. The way a fire adjusts when you open the flue, not less hot, but differently directed. "You are going to tell me," he said slowly, "how to enter my own son's presence." "Yes," she said. Another pause. Longer. "All right," he said, and opened the door quietly. She stayed outside. She stayed outside because she understood, in some wordless way, that whatever happened in that first minute was not hers to witness. That belonged to the 2 of them, to the king and his stolen son, to a reunion that had 6 months of silence and terror and love wound through it so tightly that no stranger's presence could make it anything other than smaller. She stood in the snow, and she listened to the wind in the birches. She was standing there when the second party appeared. Tarval's men came from the north. 8 of them, and they were not being quiet at all, which she understood after a moment was not a tactical choice but a consequence of fear. They knew the king's party was here. They must have been watching from the tree line. They had come anyway, which meant either they were desperate or they were following orders from someone who didn't know yet that the situation had shifted. She had about 30 seconds before they reached the yard. She turned and put her head through the doorway. The king was crouched on the floor in the center of the cottage, his dark riding coat pooled around him, and his son was standing 3 feet away, looking at him with the particular expression Caius used when he was making a very careful assessment of something. They had not touched yet. She understood it immediately. They were moving toward each other carefully, like two people who have been kept apart long enough that even the wanting of the reunion has become frightening. "Tarvel's men," she said, "coming from the north." 30 seconds. The king stood in a single movement. "Oren's company," he said to her, and it was a question that wasn't a question. "Where?" "Bolt hole. Behind the cottage." Oren separated himself from them. "He came to warn us." The gold eyes were on her face, processing. "You trust that?" "Yes. A beat, 2 beats. Then I will trust it," he said. And the 6 riders outside reorganized themselves, because he said something at the door in a voice pitched, low and flat, and then he turned back to the room. "Caius," he said. The boy had not moved. His gold eyes were moving between his father's face and the door. "Come here," Dmitri said. The boy crossed the distance and put his arms around his father's neck and Dmitri's hand. A large hand, a king's hand. She would seize later that they were scarred in a specific pattern across the knuckles. The particular scarring of a man who had been in real violence and not the staged kind. That hand came up and pressed flat against the back of his son's head, and the exhale that came out of the king in that moment was not a sound she could describe. She looked away, outside, at the men coming across the yard. The confrontation was ugly in the way of inevitable things, brief and complete and over with the thoroughness of overwhelming force. Tarvel's men understood within minutes that the heir was found, the king was present, and their employer's leverage was gone. The specific violence of it was, she heard it more than saw it from the doorway, and what she understood was, a king fighting for his son moves with a particular quality of rage that transcends strategy. But also, he was controlled. Even that. Even in the fighting, there was control. The control of a man who knows exactly how much force the situation requires and uses exactly that and no more. 3 of Tarvel's men ran. 5 surrendered. Oren was found in the bolt hole by 2 of the king's riders and brought out with his hands open. She had been right about that mattering. The sun was fully down by the time it was quiet again. She stood in the doorway of her cottage in the blue dark of full winter night, and she felt the shape of what had just happened settle around her like snow. The king's riders set up camp in the yard and the surrounding tree line. This was not a company of men that traveled without provisions, and they set up efficiently and without drama, the way of people who do this often. She watched from the step. Caius was beside her. He had been beside her since the fighting stopped. Had appeared at her elbow since he'd there, his shoulder against her hip, watching the organized activity in the yard with the expression she thought of as his assessment face. Not worried. Watching. "You should be inside," she said. "It's cold." "You are outside," he observed. She had no answer for that. Dmitri came to the door. He had to duck slightly. Not much, but enough that she noticed it. The automatic accommodation of a man accustomed to being too large for doorways. He looked at her, and then down at his son against her hip, and there was a quality to how he looked at that, the 2 of them standing together, that she couldn't read. "We'll need to move at first light," he said. He was talking to her, not to his son, which surprised her slightly. "The road will be watched. There's a camp 2 hours south." "The bolt hole," she said. "It'll be crowded, but it's warmer than tents. The soldiers can take turns. Oren knows where it is." He looked at her. "You want me to trust Oren?" "I want you to consider," she said carefully, "that a man who could have let those hunters kill your son in the forest instead led us to him, and who came to this cottage ahead of Tarvel's company specifically to give warning. That man made a choice. He made it several times, and every time he made it in your son's direction." Silence. The blue dark around them, and the camp sounds, and the fire coming from inside through the open door. "He was coerced," she said. He thought he was following legitimate orders until it was too late to walk away without consequences he couldn't afford. I'm not asking you to pardon him. I'm asking you to consider it. Dmitri looked at her for a long, considered moment. He had a quality, she was becoming familiar with it, of listening with his whole attention, which was not a quality she associated with powerful men, because in her limited experience powerful men were usually more interested in speaking. He listened the way she listened to the forest. I'll consider it, he said. Thank you, she said. Another pause. Not uncomfortable. The fire made its sounds behind them, and the camp moved, and somewhere out in the birches, one of the horses shifted its weight in the snow, with a sound like a soft percussion. Caius had fallen asleep against her hip, standing up, which was something she had learned he could do when he was tired enough. Simply stop, the way a candle goes out. She had her arm around him without having decided to put it there. How long? Dmitri said quietly. Has he been? 2 weeks, roughly. Since I found him in the snow. He was cold? The question came out differently from the ones before it. Not the commander's questions, the information-gathering questions. This was a different register entirely. He was very cold, she said, and very frightened, but he didn't show it much. He was trying not to. He is. She looked down at the sleeping boy. He is very brave. For 4, he is very, very brave. She looked up and found the king watching her face and not his son's. She held his gaze, because she was the kind of person who held gazes, and she watched something move through his expression that she still could not name. Complex. It had several things in it at once, none of which she was prepared for. Come inside, she said. It's cold. He came. That night, she made a meal that was not enough for the number of people involved. The king, herself, Caius, and she fed the riders in shifts from what she had, which was rabbit stew and hard bread and dried fruit, and not nearly enough of any of it. But she made it stretch the way her father had taught her, which was with water and with will and with careful portioning, and no one complained. She suspected no one would dare complain in the king's presence, even if they'd wanted to. But she thought also that they simply didn't. Dmitri sat at her table and ate what she gave him without remark. He ate like a man who is not accustomed to paying much attention to food, because he's too accustomed to it being provided. She watched him notice, mid-meal, that she had given herself the smallest portion, and she watched him watch her and look at his own bowl and look at hers, and she met his eyes and shook her head once, very slightly, and he ate his bowl. Caius ate everything placed in front of him, and then looked at her bowl and said, "You haven't eaten enough." "I had more earlier," she said, which was not entirely a lie. The boy gave her the look that said he knew it was not entirely a lie. Then he looked at his father. Something passed between them. The particular communication of 2 people who have known each other long enough to speak without words. And Dmitri reached past his son and put the last of his bread on Sepha's side of the table. She looked at it. She looked at him. "I am not accustomed to being hungry," he said, which was so carefully constructed to give her a way out that she had to look down to cover the thing that happened to her expression. She ate the bread. After the meal, after the riders had been organized into the bolt hole, and the camp and the arrangements had been made for the morning, after Caius had been laid in her bed. He'd gone without argument, which was how she knew he was well and truly exhausted. She sat by the fire with the low light, and the sounds of a house that had more people in it than it had ever held. Dmitri was across the fire from her. She had not expected him to stay. She had thought he would be outside, managing, commanding, doing the things that the commander of a company does when that company is setting up for the night. He had done those things. And then he had come back in. He sat in her father's chair, which was the larger of the 2 chairs, and which she had not sat in since her father died, and he sat in it with his forearms on his knees and his eyes on the fire, and she looked at his hands. She kept looking at his hands. They were. Caius had the same hands, she realized. The same shape at the knuckles, the same proportion of finger to palm. Family. The resemblance lived there, in the hands, as much as in the eyes. But the king's hands were scarred, as she'd noticed, and they were also. She looked at them and she thought, they don't know how to rest. Even now, at the fire, they were not resting. They were held, controlled, still through an act of will rather than ease. He said, Dmitri said, without looking up from the fire, that you named him. I didn't know his name, she said. Bram, he said. He seemed to be tasting the word. It fit him, I don't know why. It was what he was, in the mornings when he was a pup and the fire was low and he was the warmest thing in the cottage. She stopped. I know that's not. He has been called by his name since birth, Dmitri said. By nurses and tutors and courtiers and soldiers. He has never. He stopped. Started again, differently. He did not tell you his name for. He looked up. How long? Almost 3 weeks. The king was quiet. He told you before I found him. He needed to tell someone, she said carefully. I think he had been careful for a very long time about what he said and to whom, and he trusted me. I don't know why he trusted me. I do, Dmitri said. He said it simply, with a flatness that was not coldness but certainty, and she looked at his face, and the firelight was doing complicated things to it, finding the lines there that were not age exactly, but the specific topography of a face that has held too much for too long. The lines around his eyes, the set of his mouth. He trusts people who hold still, Dmitri said, who don't flinch or reach. He looked back at the fire. I taught him that. I taught him to watch for it. He was young to learn it. Something in his voice went briefly uneven. He had to be. She said nothing. His mother died, Dmitri said, and then stopped. She waited. When he was 8 months, he did not finish the sentence. He didn't need to. She understood the geography of that grief, the specific silence it left, the way it reshapes what you reach for and what you protect. I'm sorry, she said. 2 words. She meant them entirely. He looked at her again. The firelight and the late hour, and the weight of everything that had happened since morning were on his face, and she met it and did not look away. And they sat there in the particular intimacy of the exhausted, across a fire, in a small cottage at the edge of the world. What will you do? He said at last. After we leave. He looked at the fire. This will not be. There will be consequences for you, of our having been here. Tarvel will know this cottage. The path we leave in the snow will be visible for days. You are known now as the one who sheltered him. She had not thought this far. She examined it now, the implications laying themselves out in sequence. He was right. She was not safe here after, not immediately, not from anyone who still supported Tarvel's faction, which was unknown and might be considerable. I have a life here, she said. Yes, he said, I know. A silence that had more in it than silence usually did. There are positions, he said carefully, in the palace, for people who are good with children, with my son in particular. The careful construction of each word was visible. He was making an offer and trying to make it not sound like charity. He will need people around him who are steady, people who don't flinch. A pause. People he has chosen. She looked at the fire. I don't need charity, she said. No, he said immediately. I know you don't. That is not. He stopped, started again. With what she was coming to understand was characteristic of him. The second start always more honest than the first. He will miss you. He will not say it in a way that is legible. Because he is my son and we are both very bad at saying the things we. He stopped again. He will wake in the night. And I do not. His hands in his lap moved. Just slightly. That tells she was learning. I do not know what to do with that. I have not known what to do with him when he wakes in the night. He has always had nurses, people whose. The words failing him now are not failing but overloaded, too much in them. I don't know how to hold him. He was 8 months when I had to learn to be everything, and I have never. She watched his hands. I will hum, she said quietly. He looked at her. If he wakes, He sleeps when I hum. I don't know what. It's just something I did when he was a pup and frightened. Any low sound, I think. Something constant. She looked at the fire. You could do it. I could not. You could, she said. You'd feel ridiculous. You'd do it anyway because he'd need it. That's the thing about. She stopped. What she knew about this from 7 months of isolation and one small wolf pup was this: caring for something that needs you and cannot tell you exactly what it needs is not a skill. It is a willingness, just that. Just the willingness to be present and ridiculous and to keep going. She did not say all of this. She said, "You'd do it anyway." He looked at her. Something in his face, the careful public face of a man who has learned, through necessity, to keep most of himself behind glass. Something in it came open, just briefly, just enough. "Yes," he said, "I would." The fire crackled. From behind the loft ladder, through the heavy quiet of deep night, came the sound of a child breathing. They both listened. She made her decision before dawn. She made it lying awake in the last of the dark, listening to the boy breathe and the fire settle and the sounds of the camp outside. And she made it the way she made most decisions, which was not by reasoning toward it, but by feeling the shape of what she already knew and accepting it. She could not stay here, not safely. Not right now. She could not send him back without her. The second thing sat in her chest with the weight of something that had been true for longer than she'd admitted it. And she breathed around it, and she let it be true. She got up before the light, and she packed what was essential, the pelts she'd trade later, her father's knife, the small carved box that had her mother's ring in it, which she had never been able to wear but had never been able to leave behind. The bolt-hole provisions, what dried meat remained. Caius was awake before she'd finished. He appeared at the top of the loft ladder and looked down at her packing with the expression of a child who has learned, through necessity, to read preparation in adult behavior. "You're coming," he said. "For a while," she said, "until it's safe." He considered this. "And then?" She looked up at him. "And then we'll see." He came down the ladder. He came and stood next to her and watched her pack with the particular quality of quiet that meant he was very carefully not expressing the thing he wanted to express. She'd learned this about him. The thing he was being careful about was always visible in the thing he wasn't saying. "Bram," he said. She stopped and looked at him. "I want to be called Bram," he said. "Sometimes. Not formally. Not. Just sometimes when it's only us." "Is that?" He was looking at the floor, which was unusual for him. He generally faced things directly. She put down what she was holding. She crouched to his level. She always had to remind herself to do this, to make herself small enough that she was not large to him, and she looked at his face until he looked back. "That," she said, "is entirely up to you." The gold eyes, in the very early light, with those impossible eyelashes and the small frown he wore when he was being careful about something. They cleared, and he put his arms around her neck, and he pressed his face against her shoulder, and she closed her arms around him, and neither of them said anything. Outside, the camp was beginning to wake. The king found them like that. He opened the door. Quietly, which she'd noticed was how he did most things, quietly and with efficiency, as if motion itself were something to be conserved. And he stopped in the doorway and he saw them, and he stood there. The boy became aware of his father's presence without looking. She felt it in him, a slight adjustment, a small bracing. The particular body memory of a child who has learned that a parent's presence means transition, means leaving the safe place for the required place. He kept his arms around her neck. Dmitri was very still in the doorway. She looked at him over his son's head and she saw it happen. The thing Caius had warned her about, the thing that filled up all the space, she saw it collapse. Not all at once. The way a structure gives way when one critical support releases. A chain, a sequence, and then a new configuration. Not weakness, something else. Something that had the quality of honesty. Of a man seeing clearly what has been built without him, and not running from the seeing. His son's arms, around another person's neck. His son's choice, made without his knowledge, over 6 weeks in a trapper's cottage in the snow. "Good morning," Sepha said, because someone had to say something, and she was the kind of person who said something. "Good morning," he said. His voice was not the controlled voice. Another register entirely. Caius unwound from her, finally, and turned to face his father. He looked at his father for a moment with that measuring gold gaze, and then he did something she had not seen him do before. He crossed the room and put his arms around his father's waist. Just that. Not the formal greeting she imagined a court child was trained to give. Not the performative reunion. Just his arms around his father's waist, his face pressed against his father's stomach, and Dimitri's hand came up, that large scarred hand, and pressed against his son's dark silver hair, and he held very still, the way you hold still for something you cannot afford to startle. She turned back to her packing. She gave them the moment. She was at the door, pack on her shoulder, when Caius said, "She's coming." "I know," Dimitri said. She stopped. "I asked her," the king said, and there was something careful in how he said it, something that understood it was important to say it this way. Asked. Not required, not arranged, asked. She agreed. "Good," said Caius, with the satisfaction of someone whose administration of adults has for once produced the correct outcome. Sepha looked at the king. He looked at her. He had his hand still resting on his son's head, and his expression was, she could not name it. She had been running out of categories for this man, since she'd watched his face crack open, when she told him his son was alive and unhurt. This expression belonged to whatever category that was, and she didn't have a word for it, and she was beginning to think the word didn't exist in any language she'd learned. "Thank you," she said, which was not quite what she meant. "You should be thanked," he said, which was not quite what he meant either. They would find better words. Later, when there was time and space, and the snow was behind them, and the long work of learning each other could begin in earnest. For now, this, a doorway, a morning, a child between them, and the careful, sufficient language of two people who have already understood something important and are choosing to walk toward it. She stepped out into the snow. The road south was long. 2 days of riding, which was more than she'd ridden in years, on a horse borrowed from the king's stable hand that was nothing like the pony she'd ridden as a child. She was sore by the end of the first day, in ways she could feel with specific anatomical precision, and she did not complain, and she noticed that the king noticed her not complaining, and she noticed her noticing him, which was the point at which she decided she was too tired to track all of this, and simply rode. Caius rode in front of his father on the black horse. It was, she would think later, the image she kept from those 2 days on the road, the king's dark figure and the boy's smaller one in front of him, and the way Dimitri's arms came around to hold the reins framed his son without constraining him, a kind of shelter that didn't announce itself. He was learning. She could see it. He was paying attention the way she paid attention when she was learning something new. All of himself, no part withheld. The boy talked. He talked with the pent-up energy of a child who had been very carefully conserving his words for 6 weeks, and was now with his father's chest at his back, and the road, moving under them, releasing them all at once. She caught fragments as they rode, the cottage, the hearth, the rabbits she'd taught him to identify by track pattern, the way the bolt hole smelled of old pine and cold stone, the specific texture of the blanket he'd slept under, small things. The particular small things that children collect without meaning to, the tiny textures of a place that has been safe. Once she heard him say, "She hums, when you wake up afraid." She didn't hear Dimitri's response. She was ahead of them on the road, negotiating a narrow iced section, and she kept her eyes forward and her horse steady, and she did not let on that she had heard. That evening they camped in a valley below the ridge. The king's men set up with impressive efficiency, fires and canvas, and the organized quiet of people who do this regularly, and she sat near the main fire with Caius drowsing against her side and Orin across from her, who had been carefully and quietly included in the company rather than separated from it, which she took as the first sign that the king was, in fact, considering. Dmitri came and sat on her other side, not across the fire. Beside her, she looked at him and he looked at the fire, and the night was very cold and very clear, and the stars were the kind of stars you only get far from any cities, overwhelming in their number, and the silence between them she was learning the quality of his silences which were not empty. Orin, she said quietly. Will be heard, he said, also quietly, properly, not in a field, with the full account of what he did, and what he was coerced into, and what he chose, at the end, to do differently. A pause. That is all I can promise. It's more than he expected, she said. Is it more than you expected? She thought about it honestly. No, she said. No, it's what I expected. He looked at her then, sideways, and the fire was between them, and the boy was warm and asleep, and Orin was across the fire, and the night was around them with its cold and its stars. Why, he said, and it was a real question, not a challenge, genuinely curious, slightly baffled. The way a person sounds when they want to understand something they don't have a framework for. Because you held still, she said, at the cottage. When you saw him with me, you held still, he was quiet. You could have reached for him, you wanted to. You held still instead. She watched the fire. You watched first. She stopped. He taught me that. That's what I meant. He trusts people who watch first. I think he learned it from someone. Another silence, long and full and warm in spite of the cold. His mother, he said. She was, very still, in that way. He has it from her then, she said gently. And from me, he said, which was not boasting. It was just the flat acknowledgement of a thing that was true, and she heard in it the specific quality of a man who has had to learn to claim things about himself that grief and loss tried to take. She looked at him. He was looking at the firelight on his face doing its complicated work, and the night around them, and his son breathing against her side. Tell me about her, she said. He looked at her, and the look was startled. Not offended, startled. The way someone looks when they have been holding something very carefully for a very long time and someone else has just offered, quietly, to help carry it. Now? If you want. He was quiet for a moment. Then, slowly. She used to name everything. The horses, the furniture, the particular cloud formation over the east house that she said came back every spring. A pause. She would have named the pup. He told me the name didn't fit, Cepha said. He let me use it anyway. Dmitri almost smiled. It was not quite a smile. It lived at the edges of one. It occupied the space where a smile would go. But she saw it, and she thought, there it is. There is the one beneath the one that fills up all the space. That is, he said, entirely typical of him. She laughed softly so as not to wake the boy. He listened to her laugh with that particular stillness. The palace was large. She had known, in the abstract way of someone who has heard descriptions of things they've never seen, that it would be large. She had not had the embodied knowledge of it. She had not had the knowledge of the gate that required 3 men to open, or of the courtyard that could have held her entire trapping range, or of the staircase that went up so far she had to stop and count the floors. She had also not had the knowledge of how a palace watches, not with hostility, precisely, or not uniformly with hostility, with attention. The specific attention of a place where power is concentrated, where every new element is assessed for what it might mean, for its implications and its allegiances. The servants watched her. The courtiers watched her. The guards watched her with a professional neutrality that was itself a kind of watching. She held her head up and met all of it steadily. She was a trapper's daughter. She had looked at things that could hurt her whole life without flinching. This was new, but the skill was not. Caius walked beside her with his hand in hers. She had not expected this, in the palace, with his father beside him and the full reinstated weight of his title and his station around him. She had expected him to become in some way more formal, more distant, to reassume the particular armor that children of power learn to wear. He took her hand in the courtyard and he kept it all the way up the stairs. The courtiers watched this with varying degrees of consternation. Dmitri, walking on the boy's other side, watched it with an expression she was learning to read as something between consideration and decision. Her rooms were in the east wing, which got the morning light. She noticed this immediately, the quality of it, the way it came through the window of the sitting rooms in a particular gold shaft that was, on that first morning, almost the same color as the snowlight in the cottage when the sun came off the drifts. She stood in it for a moment, that shaft of light, with her pack at her feet and the strange enormous quiet of a large room around her, and she breathed. She was very far from home. She was also, she thought, she let herself think it fully, let it be as large as it wanted to be. She was also not unhappy, complicated, frightened, a little, uncertain, considerably, not unhappy. Winter turned the way it always does, reluctantly, then all at once. The snows began to thin in the low country in the 3rd month, though the high frontier she'd come from would keep its white cover until late spring. She watched it from the east window in the mornings. The slow change in the quality of the light, the shift from the flat cold brightness of deep winter towards something softer and more provisional. She had been given work. She had not asked for it and had half expected to have to fight for it, to be kept in comfortable uselessness in the east wing while someone else did what she was good at. But Dmitri had said, on the 3rd day, in his direct, unornamented way, "You are not decorative. What do you want to do?" She had looked at him. "With the boy," she said. "He needs." "I know what he needs," Dmitri said. "That is arranged. What else?" She had thought about it. "I want to work," she said. "Something that uses what I know. Not hunting, not here, but tracking, patterns. I can read information the way I seed snow. I know I can." He had considered this for a long moment with the quality of attention she'd learned was how he made decisions. "Intelligence," he said. "The frontier knowledge. Yes, you'd have to learn the court end of it." "I can learn." "I know," he said, again with that flat certainty, and sent her to the woman who managed the border intelligence, a sharp-eyed woman of 50 named Vassia, who had taken one look at Cepha and said, "Finally, someone who knows what a track actually looks like," and handed her a stack of reports to assess. She was, it turned out, good at it. She was good at it in the specific way that comes from years of patient observation, from knowing how to separate what is true from what an animal, or a person, wants you to believe is true. She found patterns in the reports that had been there for months and missed. She flagged border movements that turned out to be Tarvel's secondary operation, still running. She worked long hours and she did it well, and she went home to her rooms in the evenings, and sometimes Caius was there, having made his way across the palace with the confidence of a child who considers the entire building his personal territory. And they ate together and she told him what she'd seen. And he told her what he'd done with his tutors, and it was like the cottage, a smaller, warmer version. Dmitri began appearing at her door in the evenings, not in a way that was. It was not sudden. It was gradual the way winter turning is gradual, incremental, then unmistakable. He came to discuss reports at first because she was finding things and he wanted to understand her methodology. Then he came because Caius was there and the 3 of them ate together, and it was easier not to leave than to leave. Then he came because he was there in the doorway with no report and no excuse, and she let him in. They argued sometimes. About the reports, about the faction's dismantlement, which she felt was being handled too slowly, and he felt she was underestimating the political complexity of, about Oren's hearing, which she had pushed for consistently, and which happened in the 4th month and went well, as she had expected it to go. About things that were not work at all, opinions and histories, and the nature of things, in the specific arguing of two people who are interested in each other's minds and use argument as a way to get closer to them. He told her about Caius's mother. Not all at once, piece by piece. The way you excavate something carefully, when you've been keeping it buried and have finally decided that keeping it buried is costing more than uncovering it. Her name had been Mira. She had been gone for 4 years. He told Sepha about her on a night when Caius was asleep and the fire was low and the palace around them was quiet, and she listened the way she listened to everything, with all of herself, no part withheld, and she did not try to make it smaller than it was. When he was done, she said, "He has her eyes." Dmitri looked at her. "I know," he said. "Every morning." She looked at the fire. "That must be." She stopped. "Both things," he said quietly. "It is both things at once. Always." He paused. "I imagine you know something about that." She thought of her father's coat on the peg by the door that she had put in her pack and brought with her because she could not leave it behind. She thought of the mornings in the cottage when she had woken to the particular silence that her father used to fill, and the missing of it had been like a bruise that she had to navigate around carefully. And also, the fire was hers to build and the day was hers to make, and she was still here, still breathing, still present. "Yes," she said. "Both things." His hand was on the armrest. Her hand was on her knee. Neither of them moved. They stayed there a long time, in the quiet, being both things at once. Spring came, and with it the first warm evening, and the evening the faction's final hearing concluded, and the last of Tarvel's people were properly remanded. Dmitri came to her door and he said, "Come outside. I want to show you something." She came. He took her to the South Tower, which she had not been to, which had the broadest view over the valley, and the evening was still and warm, and below them the land opened up. Fields and forest and a river winding. And far in the south, faint and blue, the beginning of the mountains that marked the frontier. She stood at the tower railing and looked at it, and felt, in her chest, the specific ache of a person looking at their whole life from a height and understanding for the first time its exact shape. "It's," she started. "Yes," he said. He was beside her. She was aware of him the way she was always aware of him, the particular quality of his presence, the warmth of it, the way the air between them felt different from the air anywhere else. She had been aware of it since the night in the cottage, since the fire and the quiet and the sound of his son breathing, and she had been careful with it, because she was a careful person and because the situation was complicated, and because she was afraid. That was the honest thing, not of him, of wanting, of being the kind of person who wants the wrong thing in the wrong configuration, who loves too fast and too fully, and doesn't count the cost until the cost is already paid. "Sepha," he said. She turned. He was very close. She hadn't registered the distance closing, or she had registered it and not named it, which was different. His face in the evening light was the face she had been learning for 4 months. The lines of it, the specific geography of it, the scar she'd eventually gotten the story of. A bear, 8 years ago. The kind of story told briskly because it's old, and the specifics are less interesting than the lesson it taught. The way his eyes in certain lights were more bronze than gold, the way they went fully gold when he was decided about something. They were fully gold now. "You are going to make me say it," he said. "I'm not making you do anything," she said. "You are going to stand there and be." He stopped, utterly, infuriatingly patient, and wait. "Until I find the right words." "I've been told I do that," she said. "My son told me," he said, "several months ago." He said, "She waits, and she lets you come to it yourself. And it's very annoying when you're not ready." She laughed. That startled thing again, real and brief. He did not look away. "I'm not good at this," he said. It was not a plea. It was a fact, stated with the same directness he used for everything. "I have been a king and a soldier and a father, in that order of practice, and this. Between people, when the thing is this. I am not skilled in it, and I am aware that this is not a recommendation. No, she agreed. But I know that about you, and I'm here anyway. Something in him, she watched it, the specific shift, the release of something held. I don't want you to go back to the frontier, he said. I'm not planning to. No, I mean. He stopped, started again. The second start, always more honest. I want you to stay, not as. He looked for the word, rejected several visible candidates. I want you to stay, and I want my son to have you nearby, and I want. A pause, weighted and deliberate. I want to argue with you about border intelligence reports for a considerable number of years. She looked at him. That, he said, very quietly, is the most honest version of it I can find right now. She considered him. The evening around them, the valley below, the mountains in the south that marked the edge of everything she'd known. His face in this last light, open in the specific way it only went when it was only them. It's a good version, she said. His hand came up, the back of his fingers very gently along her jaw, asking, not taking, the specific touch of a man who has learned the difference, or is learning it, or has decided he wants to learn it. She turned her face into it slightly, the involuntary lean, the body's answer before the mind has finished its deliberation. Sepha, he said. Her name in that register, the one that wasn't the commander, wasn't the king. Yes, she said. It was not an answer to a question he'd asked. It was simpler than that. It was the body's simple yes, the one that doesn't require words. And the evening around them was warm and still, and the mountains were blue in the south, and she let herself have it. Just that. She let herself have it. Summer arrived without ceremony, the way the good things do. You look up one day, and it is simply there. The light changed, the air warm, the world a different color. Caius turned 5. There was a celebration, formal and lavish, because that was what the court required, and Caius accepted it with the particular grace of a child who has learned to receive ceremony without being altered by it. He wore the clothes they put on him, and he stood where they told him to stand, and he shook the hands extended to him with the deliberate care of a small person, practicing being a large one. But at the end of the day, when the court had gone and the hall was emptying, and the summer evening was coming through the tall windows in long gold slants, he came and found Sepha in the garden, where she'd retreated with a cup of something warm and a bench in the sun, and he climbed up beside her and leaned against her shoulder without saying anything. She put her arm around him. Good day, she said. Long day, he said. Those are sometimes the same. He considered this, sometimes. Dmitri found them there. She heard him before she saw him, the specific sound of his footfall, which she had learned without meaning to, the particular rhythm of it. And he came into the garden and stopped at the edge of the bench and looked at the two of them in the evening light. Is there room? He said. Caius moved, very deliberately, so that there was room on his other side. Dmitri sat. The bench was narrow for 3. He was close, his shoulder against hers, solid and warm, and the boy between them with his head tilting now against his father's arm. Bram, Caius said drowsily. She looked down at him. He said you can still call me that, when it's us. A pause. I told him about it, he said. The boy's voice going soft with sleep closeness. He said it was a good name for when it's us. She looked past the boy's head at Dmitri. He was already looking at her. She held his gaze, warm and even, and the evening was in the garden around them, the light going gold, the summer sounds, and she thought, here. This is what she had been waiting for. That formless waiting she used to feel watching the soldiers pass on the road below the ridge, not soldiers. Not cities. This. 3 people on a bench in a summer garden. The child's breathing slowing toward sleep between them, the light doing its slow good work on all of them. She did not name what it was. She let it be what it was. Autumn again. She remembered. Would always remember. The morning of the first year's anniversary of the day she found him in the snow. She had not planned to mark it, had not thought she would. But she woke that morning in the autumn dark, and she lay still and she breathed, and she felt the shape of the year laid out behind her, all its unexpected architecture. The frontiers in the snow, the hunters at the clearing's edge, a small silver creature pressing its cold nose against her knuckles. A choice she had not made consciously, that had made her anyway. She got up before the light. She pulled her father's coat from where she kept it, hung on a peg by the east window. She had put a peg there, specifically, on the second week. Some habits are permanent. And she went out to the south tower. The morning was cold and clear, and the world below the tower was beginning to turn. The first red in the tree line, the gold in the lower fields, the particular beauty of a world caught between two states of being, unable to fully become either, beautiful in the between. She had not been alone on this tower since the first time. She heard him come up the stairs, the specific footfall, and she turned. Dmitri stood in the doorway with his son on his shoulders, still in sleep clothes, both of them, the boy's hair in absolute chaos and his eyes barely open, held at head height with the absent ease of a man who has been doing this, putting his son on his shoulders, carrying him without thinking about it, for long enough that the ease is real. He woke, Dmitri said, by way of explanation. And when I explained where you'd gone, he would not. I'm awake, Caius said. He did not sound particularly awake. She looked at the two of them. At this, the king in his sleep clothes, with his son on his shoulders, in the early autumn cold, at the top of a tower, because the boy had woken and would not wait. Something cracked open in her chest. Not painfully, the way good things open. She held out her arms. Dmitri lifted the boy down and handed him over with the care of someone who has learned, is still learning, has decided he wants to keep learning, and Caius settled against her shoulder and blinked at the valley below with bleary gold eyes. Oh, the boy said. It's the birches. She looked. It was. The tree line below the tower was in full autumn color, and among the red and gold, the white birch trunks were visible, pale and clear. Not exactly like the frontier, but enough like it that she felt the ache and the warmth of it simultaneously, both things at once. Yes, she said. Birches. Dmitri stood beside her. His hand found hers, not reaching, just arriving, the way certainty arrives, and she held it. And the three of them stood in the early morning, at the top of the south tower, and looked at the turning world below. She had named him Bram in the snow, not knowing who he was. She had stepped between him and the hunters because something in her that did not calculate had simply moved. She had kept him warm all through the long, cold weeks, because there was no other choice her heart could make, and the whole of it. The hunters and the snow and the terrifying king in the yard, and the long road south and the border reports and the summer garden, and this morning, this specific morning, all of it had the shape, she thought, of something that had always been trying to happen, something that had known, before any of them did, where it was going. A child knows where it is safe long before the grown-ups do. That was the thing. She understood it now entirely, felt it in her chest, where it had been slowly becoming true, since the morning she crouched in the snow with her hand out, and something small and frightened chose her. He had chosen her first. He had always known. The rest of them were just catching up. The true moment, the one she would carry the longest, did not happen on the tower. It happened the following week, in the first snow of the new season. It came early. It always did, in the high country, but even at the palace elevation the first snow had a quality she recognized. Tentative, the snow not quite committed to itself yet. Unsure the way everything is at its beginning. She was in the courtyard when it started, crossing from one wing to another with a stack of reports, and she stopped because the first snow always stopped her. Old habit. The kind you don't lose. The flakes were coming straight down in the windless morning, settling on the flagstones and the grass and the iron of the gate. Very quiet. The world shifting into white. She heard running. Caius came out of the east wing door at full speed, which was unusual. He generally preserved his dignity even outdoors. And he was in his winter coat, already, which meant he'd been watching and waiting, and he ran straight to her across the courtyard and grabbed her hand and said, "Come on, where? Come on, tugging." Insistent. The dignity entirely gone, replaced by the uncomplicated urgency of a 5-year-old who has a plan. She followed him. He pulled her to the center of the courtyard, to the open space away from the walls, where the snow was coming down clean and unobstructed, and he stopped, and he turned his face up to it, eyes closed, arms slightly out from his sides, the flakes settling on his upturned face, on those extraordinary eyelashes. She stood beside him and she did the same. Eyes up, snow coming down, the cold of it, each flake distinct, the specific sensation she had known all her life, that she had thought she might be leaving behind when she left the frontier, that turned out to be here too, because snow falls on palaces the same as it falls on cottages, impartial and unchanged. She breathed. "Sepha," Kaya said, eyes still closed. "Yes. Are you happy?" She opened her eyes. She looked at the snow coming down and the courtyard around her and the small boy beside her with his face lifted to the winter, and beyond him, crossing from the south entrance, a tall figure in a dark coat who had also stopped, who was standing very still at the edge of the courtyard watching the two of them. She could not see his expression from here. She did not need to. "Yes," she said. The boy opened his gold eyes and looked at her with the expression she knew best in him, the one that was his mother's and his father's and entirely his own, and he smiled. Not the formal court smile, the composed one he practiced in polished surfaces, the real one, the one he gave rarely and with great deliberation to very specific people. "Good," he said, and then, with the tone of someone wrapping up a matter that has been pending for entirely too long, "That took a very long time." She laughed, and the sound of it went up into the snow. Across the courtyard, Dmitri walked toward them, unhurried now, no urgency. Just the walk of a man moving toward something he knows will wait for him. And when he reached them, he did not stop walking. He simply arrived, and put his hand at the small of her back, and looked down at his son in the snow, with the expression she had only seen in private, only in the evenings, only in the moments he'd decided she was safe enough to show it to, open, warm, undefended. Caius looked up at his father. He looked at Sepha. He looked at them both together, the gold eyes moving between them with the calm satisfaction of someone whose patient administration has finally produced the correct outcome. "Bram?" Sepha said softly. He took her hand. He took his father's hand. He stood between them in the first snow of the season, and he held on. And the snow came down on all three of them equally, impartial and unchanged and clean. And for a moment the whole courtyard was very quiet, and very white and very still. A family is not always the one you were born into. Sometimes it is the one a child builds, carefully and deliberately, one small choice at a time, in the snow. And the grown-ups, the ones who thought they were the ones doing the finding, they look back and understand, finally, what was happening all along. He was never lost. He always knew exactly where he was going. "That is where I'll leave you," with snow, and held hands, and the sound of a girl laughing in a palace courtyard that finally knows her name. "Thank you for spending this story with me. If you want to stay a while longer, there are more tales waiting. Of hearts that found each other sideways, of kings who had to learn to kneel, of ordinary women who turned out to be exactly what the extraordinary needed. I'll be here whenever you're ready. The fire's still warm."